There exists a fear so subtle, so deeply embedded in the fabric of our spiritual lives, that most believers never recognize its presence until it has already done its devastating work. It is not the fear of death, nor the fear of failure, nor even the fear of rejection. It is the fear that God might not show up when we need Him most. This hidden terror lives in the shadows of our prayers, whispers doubts in our moments of crisis, and slowly erodes the very foundation of our faith from within. You have felt this fear, even if you have never named it. It surfaces in that split second between crying out to heaven and waiting for an answer. It manifests in the trembling that accompanies your boldest declarations of faith. It reveals itself in the way your confidence wavers precisely when circumstances demand your strongest trust. This is not weakness. This is not spiritual immaturity. This is the human condition wrestling with the infinite mystery of divine timing and divine silence. Today, we are going to expose this hidden fear, understand how it operates, and most importantly, learn how to transform it from a weapon of destruction into a tool of deeper intimacy with the divine. We will explore 5 crucial dimensions of this spiritual battle. First, we will diagnose the true nature of this fear and why it affects even the most mature believers. Second, we will uncover the specific tactics this fear uses to weaken our faith precisely when we need it most. Third, we will discover the divine resources available to counter this assault on our trust. Fourth, we will learn practical disciplines that strengthen our spiritual immune system against doubt. Finally, we will envision what victory looks like and how this struggle ultimately deepens our relationship with God. Before we continue, if this message is already touching something deep in your heart, if you already sense that this is exactly what you needed to hear today, I ask you to do 2 things that help me tremendously. First, give this video a like. That simple gesture tells me I am on the right path. And second, and this is most important, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Why? Because what comes in the next few minutes will completely transform your understanding of faith and fear. And I need you not to miss the upcoming videos where we will delve even deeper into these truths that are changing lives. Do it now. It takes only 2 seconds, then we will continue. The fear that God will not show up operates with surgical precision, targeting the exact moment when faith transitions from theory to necessity. In comfortable seasons, when life flows smoothly and prayers seem to bounce effortlessly off the ceiling straight into heaven's throne room, this fear lies dormant. But the moment genuine crisis strikes, the moment we find ourselves in that terrible space between desperate need and divine silence, this fear awakens with savage intensity. This is not random. This timing is strategic. Fear knows that faith untested is faith unproven, and it seeks to intercept us at the precise point where our trust must become tangible action. When your child is rushed to the emergency room, when the diagnosis comes back devastating, when your marriage hangs by a thread, when your finances collapse, when depression wraps around you like a suffocating blanket, this is when the hidden fear strikes. Not before, when you could theoretically debate its validity, but during, when you need unwavering confidence in God's faithfulness. The fear manifests in predictable patterns. It begins with a simple question that seems almost reasonable. Has God heard this prayer? The question feels innocent enough, even spiritually mature. After all, we want to examine our hearts, ensure we are praying according to His will. But this innocent inquiry quickly mutates. Has God heard becomes will God answer, which transforms into can God answer, which ultimately degrades into does God care? Notice the devolution. We start questioning God's attention and end up questioning God's character. The fear does not attack God's existence. That would be too crude, too easily recognized and rejected by a sincere believer. Instead, it attacks God's involvement, His timing, his methods, his priorities. It whispers that perhaps God is real but distant, present but preoccupied, willing but limited by circumstances we cannot understand. This fear exploits our human tendency to measure divine faithfulness by our earthly expectations of timing. We cry out on Monday and expect resolution by Friday. When Friday becomes next month and next month becomes next year, the fear feeds on the silence and grows stronger. It begins to reinterpret every delay as disinterest, every period of waiting as evidence of abandonment. The most insidious aspect of this fear is how it uses our spiritual maturity against us. Newer believers often have simple, almost childlike trust that God will act. They pray with expectancy because they have not yet learned to complicate their faith with sophisticated theological concerns about unanswered prayer, divine sovereignty, and the mystery of suffering. But as we mature spiritually, as we study theology, as we observe the complexities of life and the apparent randomness of blessing and hardship, we become vulnerable to a more subtle form of doubt. The fear begins to dress itself in theological clothing. It speaks of God's higher ways, his mysterious timing, his purposes beyond our understanding. These are true concepts, biblical realities, but fear twists them into weapons of paralysis rather than pillars of trust. Instead of these truths strengthening our confidence in God's ultimate goodness, fear uses them to justify our growing uncertainty about God's immediate involvement in our specific circumstances. We begin to hedge our prayers with escape clauses. "If it be your will" becomes our standard preface, not as an expression of submission, but as protection against disappointment. We lower our expectations to protect ourselves from the pain of unmet hopes. We become sophisticated in our doubt, theologically educated in our skepticism, spiritually mature in our fear of being disappointed by God. This fear also feeds on comparison. It watches as some believers seem to experience miracle after miracle, while others endure season after season of unanswered prayers. It points to the prosperity of the wicked and the suffering of the righteous. It highlights every instance where good people face horrible circumstances, while selfish people seem to be blessed beyond measure. The fear uses these observations to build a case that God's faithfulness is selective, his attention sporadic, his love conditional. The fear becomes particularly aggressive when we face the same challenges repeatedly. The first time cancer strikes, we rally our faith, mobilize our prayer warriors, declare healing with confidence. But if cancer returns, the fear whispers that perhaps God was not listening the first time, or perhaps he was listening but chose not to act. Each repeated crisis becomes evidence that our faith is ineffective, that our prayers are hollow, that God's commitment to us is questionable. This creates a vicious cycle. The more we need faith, the weaker our faith becomes. The more desperate our circumstances, the more the fear convinces us that desperation itself is evidence that God has abandoned us. We begin to interpret our very need for divine intervention as proof that divine intervention is not coming. The fear also exploits our human need for control. Deep down, we want to believe that there is a formula for faith, a method for ensuring God's response, a way to guarantee his intervention. We study the prayers of others, trying to decode the secret of their apparent success. We examine our own lives for hidden sin, unconfessed rebellion, insufficient faith, inadequate surrender. The fear convinces us that God's silence is always our fault, that if we could just discover the right combination of words, works, or worship, we could unlock heaven's response. This self-blame becomes another weapon in fear's arsenal. Instead of driving us closer to God in our desperation, it drives us away in our shame. We stop praying with boldness because we assume our previous prayers were somehow defective. We become cautious in our requests, tentative in our declarations, hesitant in our worship. The fear has successfully transformed us from confident children approaching a loving father into nervous subjects approaching an unpredictable king. But the fear makes a crucial miscalculation. It assumes that God's faithfulness can be measured by our ability to perceive it, that His love can be quantified by our capacity to understand it, that His involvement can be verified by our timeline for receiving it. This assumption reveals the fear's fundamental flaw and opens the door for our counterattack. If you have made it this far, it is because something in your spirit recognizes the truth of what we are exploring. Do not let this message remain only in your mind. Subscribe to the channel right now if you have not already, because in the coming days, I will share specific strategies for breaking free from this cycle of fear and doubt. Give it a like if this is helping you, and share this video with someone you know needs to hear these words. Your subscription is not just a number to me, it is one more person choosing to walk in spiritual freedom. The divine response to our hidden fear does not begin with explanation, but with presence. While fear demands that God prove His faithfulness through immediate intervention, faith discovers God's faithfulness through sustained communion. This is the first great reversal we must understand. God does not overcome our fear by eliminating every circumstance that might produce fear. Instead, He transforms our relationship to those circumstances by deepening our awareness of His unchanging presence within them. Consider the pattern revealed in Scripture. When Daniel faced the lion's den, God did not prevent his being thrown into danger. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego faced the fiery furnace, God did not spare them from the flames. When Paul faced shipwreck, imprisonment, and beatings, God did not create a shield of protection around His apostle. But in each case, God revealed His faithfulness, not by removing the challenge, but by demonstrating His presence within it. This is profoundly different from what our fear expects. Fear wants God to prove Himself by changing our circumstances. Faith discovers God by encountering Him within our circumstances. Fear seeks evidence that God will act. Faith finds evidence that God is acting, has been acting, will continue acting, even when His action does not match our prescription for how He should proceed. The divine presence operates on frequencies that fear cannot detect. Fear listens for the thunderclap of miraculous intervention. But God often speaks in the whisper of sustained grace, the quiet strength that enables us to endure what we thought would destroy us, the unexplained peace that settles over our hearts in the midst of chaos, the unexpected wisdom that emerges from our confusion, the supernatural love that flows through us toward others, even when we feel empty ourselves. These manifestations of divine faithfulness are no less real than dramatic healings or financial miracles, but they require spiritual eyes, trained to perceive subtlety rather than spectacle. Fear makes us spiritually nearsighted, able to see only immediate, obvious, unmistakable displays of power. Faith develops spiritual far-sightedness, recognizing God's hand in the gradual, the gentle, the sustained, the quiet transformation that occurs over months and years rather than minutes and hours. The divine response also includes what Scripture calls the fellowship of His sufferings. This is perhaps the most difficult truth for Western Christianity to embrace, but it is essential for overcoming the fear that God will not show up. Sometimes God shows up not by removing our pain, but by entering into it with us. Not by ending our struggle, but by strengthening us through it. Not by solving our problem, but by using our problem to accomplish purposes we cannot yet see. This is not divine cruelty, this is divine intimacy. When God allows us to walk through valleys of shadow rather than around them, He is not abandoning us to face darkness alone. He is joining us in the darkness, revealing dimensions of his character that can only be experienced in suffering, developing capacities in our spirits that can only be forged under pressure, creating testimonies that can only emerge from triumph over genuine adversity. Fear interprets these experiences as evidence of God's absence. Faith recognizes them as invitations to deeper intimacy. Fear sees suffering as proof that our prayers have failed. Faith discovers suffering as the classroom where our most powerful prayers are learned. Fear views hardship as abandonment. Faith experiences hardship as apprenticeship. The divine response also manifests through what we might call supernatural sustainability. When we face circumstances that should destroy us, break us, drive us to despair or madness, and yet we find ourselves still standing, still hoping, still loving, still trusting, this itself is evidence of divine faithfulness. The fact that we have not been consumed by our trials is not natural, it is supernatural. The grace to endure what feels unendurable is as much a miracle as any instantaneous healing. This sustainability often goes unrecognized because it feels so ordinary. We expect miracles to be dramatic, obvious, undeniable. But the miracle of grace that enables a mother to continue loving after losing a child, the miracle of hope that sustains a spouse through years of marriage difficulty, the miracle of joy that bubbles up in a heart-facing terminal illness. These are manifestations of divine power as profound as any parting of waters or raising of the dead. God also responds to our hidden fear through the ministry of his people. When we are tempted to believe that God has forgotten us, he sends someone to speak exactly the words we need to hear. When we feel isolated in our struggle, he connects us with others who have walked similar paths. When we question whether anyone cares about our pain, he mobilizes his body to surround us with practical love and support. Fear wants us to interpret these human expressions of care as merely natural kindness. But faith recognizes the supernatural orchestration behind what appears to be coincidence. The friend who calls exactly when we need encouragement, the stranger who offers help precisely when we are overwhelmed, the book that falls into our hands containing the exact insight we require, the sermon that addresses our specific struggle. These are not random occurrences, but evidences of a God who works through his people to demonstrate his faithful attention to our needs. The divine response includes prophetic preparation. Often God prepares us for challenges before they arrive, building spiritual muscle through smaller tests so that we will be ready for greater ones. The faith developed during minor difficulties becomes the foundation for trusting God through major crises. The patience learned in everyday frustrations prepares us for seasons of extended waiting. The peace cultivated during normal stress equips us to remain stable during extraordinary pressure. Fear cannot recognize this preparation because it interprets every difficulty as an attack rather than training. But faith begins to see the pattern, understanding that God uses each challenge to strengthen us for the next one, that he never allows us to face anything for which he has not already provided the grace to endure it. God's response to our hidden fear ultimately centers on the cross. When fear whispers that God might not show up for us, faith points to the historical reality that God has already shown up in the most dramatic way possible. The incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is not just the foundation of our salvation. It is the permanent answer to every question about God's commitment to us. If God was willing to sacrifice his own Son to secure our eternal relationship with him, what possible circumstance could arise that would cause him to abandon us now? If he demonstrated his love through the ultimate costly action, on what basis would we assume that he has suddenly become indifferent to our temporal needs? The cross is not just the solution to our sin problem, it is the eternal refutation of our fear that God will not come through for us. This is why Scripture repeatedly directs our attention back to the cross, not as ancient history, but as present reality. The God who did not spare his own Son but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? This is not wishful thinking, this is logical necessity. The greater gift guarantees the lesser ones. What we have just explored in these last minutes has the power to change everything, but only if you stay connected to this teaching. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, this is the moment. Do not allow the enemy to make you forget what the Spirit has just shown you. Give it a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and make sure you are here when I publish the next video that will perfectly complement everything we have seen today. The transformation from fear-dominated faith to fear-resistant faith requires intentional spiritual disciplines, practices that gradually rewire our default responses to uncertainty and train our hearts to rest in God's faithfulness, even when we cannot trace his hand. These are not quick fixes or magical formulas, but proven pathways that have guided believers through doubt into deeper trust for centuries. The first discipline is contemplative Bible reading, specifically focused on God's track record of faithfulness throughout history. Fear thrives on selective memory, highlighting every instance where our prayers seemed to go unanswered while conveniently forgetting countless examples of God's provision, protection, and presence. We must actively counter this selective amnesia by regularly reviewing the biblical narrative of divine faithfulness. This is not casual Bible study, but intentional meditation on God's character as revealed through his actions. We trace his faithfulness to Abraham through decades of waiting for the promised child. We follow his provision for Israel through 40 years of wilderness wandering. We observe his presence with David through seasons of persecution, exile, and warfare. We study his commitment to the apostles through imprisonment, persecution, and martyrdom. But we must also chronicle our own personal history of divine faithfulness. Too often, we treat God's past interventions in our lives as isolated incidents rather than evidence of his ongoing commitment to us. We must develop the discipline of remembering, creating written records of prayers answered, crises survived, needs met, doors opened, relationships restored, healing received, provision supplied. This is not religious positive thinking, but spiritual warfare through testimony. When fear whispers that God will not show up this time, we respond with documented evidence that he has shown up repeatedly in the past. When doubt suggests that our current situation is beyond divine help, we counter with specific examples of God's power demonstrated in our own experience. The second discipline is strategic fasting, not as religious performance, but as spiritual training. Fasting teaches us to distinguish between what feels necessary and what is actually necessary, between what we think we cannot live without and what we can actually release. When we voluntarily abstain from food, comfort, entertainment, or convenience, we discover that our survival is less dependent on external circumstances than we imagined. This discovery directly counters the fear that God will not provide what we need, as we learn that we can be content with less, peaceful without constant stimulation, secure without absolute control. We build confidence that we can navigate whatever challenges life presents. Fasting proves to us that our well-being is not as fragile as our fears suggest. Fasting also creates space for deeper prayer and meditation. When we remove the distractions that normally occupy our time and attention, we become more sensitive to God's voice, more aware of his presence, more attuned to his leading. The silence that fear interprets as God's absence becomes the quiet space where faith hears his whisper. The third discipline is intercessory prayer, specifically praying for others who are facing similar struggles. Fear is inherently self-focused, turning our attention inward toward our own pain, our own needs, our own uncertainties. When we pray for others, We break fear's narcotic spell and reconnect with the larger story of God's work in the world. As we intercede for others, we often receive insight into our own situations. As we ask God to strengthen others' faith, our own faith is strengthened. As we declare God's faithfulness on behalf of others, we remind ourselves of truths we had begun to doubt. Intercessory prayer transforms us from victims of our circumstances into partners with God in His redemptive work. This prayer must be specific and sustained. We choose individuals by name and commit to pray for them regularly over extended periods. We learn their stories, understand their struggles, celebrate their breakthroughs. As we witness God's faithfulness in their lives, our confidence in His faithfulness toward us increases. The fourth discipline is sacrificial service, particularly toward those whose needs are greater than our own. Fear convinces us that we are too weak, too broken, too overwhelmed to help anyone else. But when we step outside our own struggles to serve others, we discover reserves of strength we did not know we possessed. We find that giving comfort to others comforts us, that providing hope to others restores our own hope. This service must be costly, requiring genuine sacrifice of our time, energy, or resources. Only when service costs us something does it counter fear's message that we have nothing to offer. When we serve from our weakness, we discover God's strength. When we give from our lack, we experience His provision. When we love despite our own pain, we encounter His healing. The fifth discipline is prophetic declaration, speaking truth over our circumstances before we see evidence of that truth in our natural circumstances. This is not positive thinking or wishful speaking, but declaring God's character and promises over our situations based on His revealed word rather than our present experience. We must be careful here. Prophetic declaration is not demanding that God conform to our timeline or our preferred solutions. It is aligning our speech with His revealed character and purposes, declaring His faithfulness when circumstances suggest unfaithfulness, proclaiming His love when experiences feel like rejection, affirming His presence when emotions scream abandonment. This discipline trains us to speak from faith rather than fear, to let truth shape our words rather than letting circumstances dictate our declarations. As we hear ourselves speaking faith, our hearts begin to align with our words. As we declare God's goodness, we become more sensitive to evidence of that goodness. As we proclaim His faithfulness, we develop eyes to see that faithfulness in ways we previously missed. The sixth discipline is community accountability, surrounding ourselves with believers who will speak truth to us when fear begins to distort our perspective. We all have blind spots, areas where our emotions cloud our judgment, situations where our pain makes it difficult to see clearly. We need trusted friends who love us enough to challenge our fear-based interpretations of our circumstances. This accountability must be mutual. We commit to being honest about our struggles with doubt and fear, and we give others permission to question our conclusions when those conclusions seem driven more by emotion than by truth. We create safe spaces where doubt can be expressed without judgment, but also where doubt can be challenged with love. The community must be chosen carefully. We need people who understand both the reality of struggle and the reliability of God's faithfulness. We need believers who have walked through their own valleys of shadow and emerged with deeper faith rather than cynical resignation. We need friends who can weep with us in our pain while still pointing us toward hope. The seventh discipline is contemplative worship, engaging with God not only through requests, but through adoration, not only through petition, but through praise. Fear makes us transactional in our relationship with God, turning prayer into a vending machine where we insert requests and expect to receive desired outcomes. Worship breaks this transactional mentality by focusing on God's worth rather than our wants. In worship, we declare God's goodness not because of what He has done for us, but because of who He is. We praise His faithfulness, not because we have received everything we have asked for, but because faithfulness is essential to His character. We honor His love, not because we feel loved, but because He is love itself. This worship must be both private and corporate, both spontaneous and disciplined, both emotional and intellectual. We must learn to worship in seasons of blessing and seasons of waiting, in times of clarity and times of confusion, in moments of strength and moments of weakness. As worship becomes our default response to both joy and sorrow, fear loses its power to hijack our thoughts and emotions. These 7 disciplines work together to create what we might call spiritual muscle memory. Automatic responses that kick in when fear attempts to undermine our faith. Like a martial artist who practices movements repeatedly until they become instinctive, we practice these spiritual disciplines until trusting God becomes our natural response to uncertainty. The goal is not perfection, but progress. We will still experience moments of doubt, seasons of questioning, times when fear seems stronger than faith. But as these disciplines become embedded in our lives, those moments become shorter and less frequent. The recovery time between doubt and trust decreases. The intensity of fear's assault diminishes. Remember, these disciplines are not laws but tools, not requirements but resources. They are means of grace, pathways that connect us more deeply to the source of all strength, wisdom, and peace. They work not because they earn God's favor, but because they align our hearts with His heart, tune our spirits to His frequency, train our minds to think His thoughts. Victory over the hidden fear does not mean the absence of all uncertainty or the guarantee of specific outcomes according to our timeline. Victory means the development of unshakable confidence in God's character regardless of our circumstances. It means learning to rest in His love when we cannot understand His methods, to trust His heart when we cannot trace His hand, to believe in His goodness when His ways seem mysterious. This transformation changes everything about how we approach difficulty. Instead of each crisis becoming a test of whether God cares about us, each challenge becomes an opportunity to discover new dimensions of His faithfulness. Instead of viewing unanswered prayer as evidence of divine indifference, we begin to recognize different forms of divine response. Instead of measuring God's love by our comfort level, we learn to perceive His love in His willingness to walk with us through necessary hardship. The believer who has conquered the hidden fear prays differently. Prayer becomes less about convincing God to change our circumstances and more about positioning ourselves to receive whatever grace is needed for whatever circumstances we face. We still bring our requests boldly before His throne, but we hold those requests with open hands, trusting that His response will be perfectly timed and perfectly suited to our ultimate good. This transformed prayer life affects every area of our existence. We approach relationships with less anxiety because we trust that God is at work even in relational conflict. We face financial challenges with more peace because we have learned that our security rests in God's provision rather than our savings account. We confront health issues with greater stability because we know that our ultimate healing is guaranteed even if our temporal healing is delayed. The fear-free believer also serves differently. No longer paralyzed by uncertainty about personal outcomes, we become free to invest ourselves fully in God's kingdom purposes. We can take risks for the gospel because we trust God's faithfulness regardless of results. We can love sacrificially because we are not protecting ourselves from disappointment. We can give generously because we are confident in divine provision. This transformation affects our witness to others. When unbelievers observe our peace in the midst of genuine difficulty, our hope in the face of real challenge, our love despite personal pain, they encounter evidence of supernatural reality. Our lives become testimonies to God's faithfulness, not because everything goes smoothly for us, but because we demonstrate stability that cannot be explained by our circumstances. The ultimate victory over hidden fear is not the absence of difficult questions, but the presence of unshakable trust. We may not understand why suffering exists, why prayers sometimes seem unanswered, why good people face horrible circumstances, why God's timeline often differs from our preferences, but we learn to hold these mysteries within the larger certainty of God's love, faithfulness, and ultimate goodness. This is mature faith, faith that has been tested and proven, faith that can withstand the storms of doubt, because it is anchored not in perfect understanding, but in perfect trust. This faith does not require complete answers, because it rests in complete confidence in the one who holds all the answers. If this message has transformed something in you, if you now see faith and fear with new eyes, then you need to do 3 things before you finish this video. First, give it a like, because that helps me show this content to more people who are struggling like you were. Second, subscribe to the channel if you have not done so, because I will continue bringing deep teachings that will equip you for the spiritual battle you face every day. And third, share this video. Send it to someone who is going through this, because maybe you are the instrument God will use to change their life. See you in the next video, where we will explore how to maintain this victory when life tests your faith again. May the Spirit guard and strengthen you. The journey from fear-dominated faith to fear-resistant faith is not a one-time transformation, but a lifelong process of growth, discovery, and deepening trust. As we implement these disciplines, embrace these truths, and walk in this victory, we find that what once threatened to destroy our faith ultimately becomes the catalyst for developing unshakable confidence in God's character and purposes. Today, you have been equipped with tools that have sustained believers through centuries of challenge and uncertainty. You have received insights that can transform not only your relationship with God, but your approach to every difficulty you will ever face. The hidden fear that once weakened your faith precisely when you needed it most can now become the trigger that activates your trained responses of trust, worship, and surrender. But remember, knowledge without application remains powerless. Truth without practice stays theoretical. Insight without implementation changes nothing. The transformation you seek, the victory you desire, the peace you long for, all await your decision to move from understanding to action, from agreement to application, from inspiration to implementation. The choice before you is clear. You can return to the old patterns of fear-dominated faith, allowing uncertainty to erode your confidence and circumstances to dictate your trust. Or you can begin today to build the spiritual muscles that will sustain you through any storm, develop the disciplines that will keep you anchored to truth regardless of your emotions, and cultivate the relationship with God that transforms every trial into an opportunity for deeper intimacy. Your faith is too precious to remain vulnerable to the hidden fear. Your relationship with God is too important to be held hostage by circumstances. Your peace is too valuable to be controlled by uncertainty. Today marks the beginning of a new chapter in your spiritual journey, a chapter where faith grows stronger under pressure rather than weaker, where trust deepens through testing rather than diminishes, where victory emerges from the very battles that once threatened defeat. The God who has brought you this far will carry you the rest of the way. The one who began a good work in you will complete it. The Father who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for you, will also, along with him, graciously give you all things. This is not hope built on wishful thinking, but confidence grounded in demonstrated love, proven faithfulness, and unchanging character. Go forward in faith, walk in victory, Trust in his unfailing love. And remember, the next time circumstances tempt you to question God's faithfulness, you now know the truth that sets you free. The hidden fear has been exposed, its tactics revealed, its power broken. You are equipped, you are prepared, you are ready to trust God completely, regardless of what tomorrow may bring.